Yes.
So the next document I want to take you to is DHSC 302211_030. And it's a supplement to the report that we looked at before. My understanding is that it was provided for a meeting that took place in September 1981. Just on the, we'll go over to page 2, paragraph 1. We note that since the last report that the Haemophilia Centre's directors have said that the quantity of cryoprecipitate had been overestimated, and so they've reduced the amount of plasma required down to 435,000 kilos, which can be processed to provide 95 million international units of intermediate concentrate and 5 million international units of cryoprecipitate at current yields. So that's the figure they're working from. And I just wanted to draw attention, sir, to page 4 of the report. Pages 2 and 3 set out how they get to the figures at page 4. I don't think we need to go through the detail, but summary and conclusions, they set out in the report how much it will cost to produce the 435,000 units, kilograms, of plasma via the different processes that they looked at in the first report. Processing cost of doing it via whole blood, so your 200 kilograms of plasma from whole blood plus your 235 kilograms from whole blood, discarding the red cells, will cost you £28.1 million. So it seems that the discarding of the red cells is an expensive process. The cost of producing a balance of 235,000 kilograms by machine pheresis is 19.1 million, and the cost of producing it by manual pheresis is 17.3 million.
Well, the significant figures are really not the headlines figures, but they're the difference between.
Indeed.
Getting out of whole blood donations, that's 20.6. Machine pheresis, almost half that, 11.6, and less than half the original by manual pheresis, 9.8.
Indeed. And then at the bottom of that page, it says, apart from the ethical considerations of discarding red cells from whole donations and the difficulties that would be encountered in recruiting sufficient donors, this option would be prohibitively expensive. From the data analysed, manual pheresis seems to be the most economical way to achieve the required plasma volume. It's significant in this regard that commercial manufacturers of blood products use manual plasmapheresis to obtain their raw material. And then if we go over to page 5, we can see what the committee are recommending at the bottom. It says there, the advisory committee is asked to approve the supplementary report to AC 8111 and to seek Minister's agreement with respect to consultation with RHAs with a view to determining the supply levels of plasma for the redeveloped BPL. And the advisory committee is asked to consider the future role of the working party with respect to discussions with RTDs on the supply of plasma and a consideration in detail of the plasma requirements for the preparation of specific immunoglobulins. So that seems to be the position in September 1981. When we can see that when we trace the documents through, that indeed the advisory committee did approve the supplementary report, and we can see that, and we don't need to go to it. And DHSC 001136. I think, 3 zeros, 1136. Beg your pardon. And they did indeed agree to consultation with the regional health authorities. I'm going to take you now, sir, to a document in October 1983, so 2 years on. It's NHBT 301066_004. And this is a document, it's entitled Departmental Memorandum, and we can see it's from Dr. Gunson to Dr. Aitchison, the CMO, dated 18th October 1983. So we can understand, I think, probably from the fact that it's a departmental memorandum, that this must be Dr. Gunson as consultant advisor to the CMO, providing his views to the CMO. And it's entitled Subject Speciality Blood Transfusion, 5 years forward and 5 years back. So he sets out an introduction and he sets out some history at the beginning of that page. And then at the second half of the page, in a paragraph, it would be useful to review the developments which have taken place in the use of these products. Red cell concentrates. Clinical acceptance of this product has been subjected to some controversy since in order to provide sufficient plasma for fractionation, the red cell concentrates have to be administered to certain patients suffering from blood loss. And then picking up at the bottom of that page, the principle involved is to remove as much plasma from the donation as possible and replace part of this with a solution of saline adenine glucose and mannitol or sorbitol. The resultant red cells can be stored for up to 35 days and their administration is facilitated. This approach also has the benefit that from an individual donation of whole blood, 50% more plasma can be obtained. And then he goes on to talk about platelet concentrates and he says the use of increasing pharmacopoeia of chemotherapeutic agents has resulted in patients suffering from leukemia and certain other malignancies requiring supportive therapy for longer periods. One problem with this product is that it has had a shelf life of only 3 days, and with variable demand it has been difficult to either avoid wastage or meet demands. During the past 2 years, new plastics have been developed which allow the storage period to be extended to 5 days. While this will be a benefit, the increasing demand for this product is causing problems at present, and alternative methods for the preparation of platelet concentrates will have to be considered, particularly with the increase in such procedures as bone marrow transplantation. So again, another sort of technical advance which has made a difference to the blood service.
By new plastics, it means plastic bags, does it, to contain?
That's my understanding, but I may be corrected by an honourable witness, but that's my understanding. And then with regard to factor VIII concentrates, there's been an increase in production of this material at the Blood Products Laboratory from plasma collected at the regional transfusion centres during the past 5 years. At present, approximately 40% of the factor VIII used is derived from this source. The remainder is purchased from commercial firms and their products are imported largely from the USA. And then mentions factor IX concentrate and immunoglobulins and albumin. And then at the bottom of that page, it comes on to disease transmission. Certain products have always carried the danger of transmission of hepatitis. With the introduction of sensitive screening tests on all donations, for example, by radioimmune assay, the incidence of hepatitis B has been reduced, although not eliminated. The administration of the vaccine to high-risk groups may also assist in this regard. However, the problem of non-A, non-B hepatitis remains, and there is now the potential transmission of AIDS, about which I spoke at the last consultant advisors meeting. So it's clear that Dr. Gunson has been keeping Dr. Richardson, or been providing advice to him about AIDS by October 1983. And then can we go over the page then, please, to page 3, and we see what Dr. Gunson says about the next 5 years. Whilst I think there will be several developments occurring in the field of blood transfusion, some of which will be referred to below, I think the major advance that can be made is to achieve self-sufficiency in blood products for the UK. And then he sets out the implications for the service of self-sufficiency. And then he goes on below 2. In order to achieve this goal, investment will be required, but it's important that advantages are taken of recent developments to minimise this. So he speaks about the role of the additive solution in increasing plasma collection. He then talks at 2.2 about the use of plasmapheresis, which was what we saw his committee championing 2 years previously in 1981. Although this is used in the transfusion service at present on a small scale, largely for donors whose plasma contains a high titer of specific antibodies, it is my view that in order to obtain sufficient plasma for self-sufficiency in fractionated products, without excessive blood collection and wastage of red cells, plasmapheresis will be needed. And then he explains that will be costly in the next two paragraphs, and equipment will be required. And then he goes on to say it will be an advantage when all blood products can be derived from the UK donor population. Nevertheless, the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis, particularly from the products derived from pooled plasma, will still be a problem in groups of patients such as haemophiliacs who receive these products regularly. I expect from the work which is now being carried out that by the time 5 years has elapsed, a diagnostic test will be available.
May be available.
May be available, I beg your pardon, yes. However, in the meantime, we must examine ways in which in certain groups of patients, exposure to the minimum number of donors can be affected. With respect to AIDS, it is too early to anticipate the effects in the UK, but it is important that every opportunity is taken to investigate possible ways in which the blood donor population can be screened. And then he goes on to talk about the organisational, on an organisational level. He says, on an organisational level, there's been a noticeable degree of collaboration between the regional transfusion centres in recent years, and there are now an increasing number of functions which are nationally based rather than regionally. And he says the supply of plasma referred to above is one. Now, just pausing there, it's right that we've seen the supply of plasma being expressed as a national figure, but of course we still have regional funding and the difficulties. I'm going to come on and look at some documents now which show the difficulties that gives rise to. So if we can look then at CBLA 301800, which is a report to the CBLA by Dr. Gunson. And we can see at the bottom there, it's dated January 1984. And he explains that he had a meeting in June 1983 with regional transfusion directors to discuss plasma targets, and the results were encouraging, and that they thought at that time that they would be able to meet the targets and get financing. And then he goes on in the second paragraph to explain that during the latter part of 83, informal comments from some RTDs gave cause for concern in that targets which had been agreed as a planned programme were in jeopardy because of difficulty in obtaining the necessary funds. So he wrote to the RTDs in December 1983, and he goes down in the next paragraph to explain that only 3 of the RTDs are confident that their RHA will support the programme for increasing the plasma supply. The remaining replies range between not hopeful of the necessary finance to an inability to predict the outcome of discussions with the RHA. And then he sets out factors of significance. Many RHAs are not willing to consider proposals on more than a year-by-year basis. Plans for the plasma supplied require a programme based on 3 to 5 year period. Several regions are finding that with the current national plasma supply of 150 kilograms per year, the demand for PPF is satisfied. Apparently, is satisfied, I'm not quite sure what that says, apparently. So, since, in my view, insufficient time has passed with the increased supply of PPF to make a valid judgment, I'm not quite sure what that says. Conclusion, however, has led to the view that the most economical way to achieve self-sufficiency is to purchase the additional quantity, I think that says, of factor VIII required. So I think that last sentence is the key part to that paragraph too. And it's doubtful whether the quantity of plasma in 1984-85 will exceed that of the current year. So that's the position and the concern that has arisen in January 1984, despite 6 months previously, regional transfusion centres being optimistic that they would be able to meet their targets. If we can then turn to a report that Dr. Gunson wrote in February 1984 arising out of this, and that's DHSC 301967. And we can see at the top, plasma supply for self-sufficiency in blood products, analysis of options by H.H. Gunson, and it's a supplement to a report to the CBLA made on 25th of January 1984. And if we go to the bottom of page 2, we can see that it's dated the 13th of February 1984. And then if we go back to page 1, he says, my conclusions following a survey of RTCs that it's unwise to assume at the present time that a sufficient quantity of plasma will be available for the successful operation of the new BPL. So he gives consideration to the options which may be available. So the first option is to pursue the present policy of encouraging RTDs to apply to their RHAs for finance for the increase in plasma supply, with the assistance of Dr. Lane and Mr. Armour, where that is appropriate. And he goes on to say in that next paragraph, this approach could be supplemented by additional advice from the DHSS, but he concludes that's already been tried, and although most RHAs agreed in principle, few have actually allocated finance for the purpose of the additional supply of plasma. Then, second option, the CBLA should assume managerial responsibility for the entire work of the RTCs. He thinks this has considerable merit because it would lead to a true national service with a greater degree of standardisation, but goes on to conclude at that second paragraph that from a practical point of view, the necessary administrative infrastructure could not be achieved by 1986 when the new BPL is due to be in full production. And so he comes up with what might be described as a hybrid option, option 3, which is the option that he plumps for, which is that the CBLA should finance the collection of plasma in excess of that harvested by the RTCs in 1983-84. And this would require funding for the collection of approximately 300,000 litres of plasma annually. And he describes this as a promising option, and each RTC would be assessed with respect to its potential for producing plasma and the necessary financing agreed. Regional health authorities could purchase from the CBLA the products which they require. And then he goes over the page to set out that he doesn't underestimate the difficulties that would involve, because RTCs would be acting on an agency basis for the CBLA. There would have to be accountability for investment and so on. A proportion of the plasma would have been paid for by the RHAs, and products derived from those would have to be supplied on a different basis from those derived from the plasma financed by the CBLA, and then the issue of clinical freedom, which may result in the continuation of purchases of blood products from commercial firms. And that is a theme that we will see in some of the documents undoubtedly as we go through the hearings, that the principle of clinical freedom raises a concern to the blood service because while there may be BPL product available, clinicians may choose not to use it. And he says, despite the problems, I submit that this option is worthy of consideration. And then he, at the bottom of that document, discounts the option of purchasing plasma from the United States to fill the gap left by the national supply. So that is the position that Dr. Gunson is advancing in February 1984. I think it might be a suitable time, sir, now to play we've got a couple of extracts from the World in Action documentary entitled Bad Blood, which aired on the 22nd of July 1985, in which Dr. Gunson is asked some questions.
The failure to meet the demand for factor VIII and so have to import 60% at a cost of £5 million a year is remarkable because Britain pioneered the concept of the volunteer blood transfusion service.
Given that we have over 1 million people who give blood every year, why did we fail to provide enough of the raw material? Well, I think in many ways the estimates of what was required escalated very rapidly, more rapidly than the transfusion service was able to accommodate. And of course, there was the problems with respect to the ability to fractionate all the material that could have been collected from transfusion centres.
But doesn't it seem that somebody somewhere made a mistake in the sense that we should have made such a tremendous underestimate of the amount that will be required? Like the difference between 1/3 and 2/3?
Yes, well, I don't think you can pin mistakes on things. I mean, this is the development of medicine. You may say that we were slow to react to the situation, but I think one has to recognise now that there is an urge to correct this situation.
Ironically, haemophiliacs are facing up to the threat from AIDS just when the goal of self-sufficiency in factor VIII for Britain seems to be at hand. At Elstree, the new plant to supply all Britain's needs is nearing completion at a final cost of £35 million. Production will start next year and full capacity should be reached in early 1987, 10 years after self-sufficiency was first promised. Once that target is reached, imports from dubious donors should end. But already, doubts are being expressed about whether that will happen. The worry centres on the vital raw material, plasma. The blood transfusion service is confident it can supply 2/3 of what is required from existing donors. But Elstree will have to rely for the other third on a new process for collecting plasma, plasmapheresis. Blood is taken from a donor, but only the plasma is retained. The red cells are returned. For Elstree to be fully supplied, plasmapheresis centres must be operating in every one of the 14 regions in England and Wales. But with 18 months to go, only half the regions have even started plasmapheresis. The total output by this method is less than 10% of what will be required if Elstree is to operate at full capacity.
Regional health authorities have many priorities for expenditure. And in some, the expenditure to provide plasma for self-sufficiency has gone on faster than in others. But I think each regional health authority and its transfusion centre is fully aware of the problem and the target date of 1987.
Even though they may not have done too much about it?
At the moment, yes.
I mean, wouldn't it be a tremendous failing on the part of the blood transfusion service if all the money, the £35 million that's to be spent at Elstree, was spent, and in 1987, when it was in full production, the blood transfusion service couldn't provide the raw material?
Oh, indeed. That would be an unpleasant situation.
So in the written presentation there, it traces through a number of other documents the story, if you like, of self-sufficiency in relation to Dr. Gunson. For reasons of time, I'm going to pick the story up in broad terms once he becomes the national director in 1988, not by reference to any documents, but we can see in the documentation in the minutes of the meetings that he attends as national director, indeed the first minute of the first meeting he attends for the as national director, that unsurprisingly self-sufficiency is high on the agenda, and the steps that he can take in his new role. And of course, one of the key policy decisions that was made was in relation to cross-accounting, which was the that came in on the 1st of April 1989, whereby BPL bought plasma from the regional transfusion centres, and then regional transfusion centres could charge hospitals for the products that they produced. And I'm just going to refer you to one document that shows that there was a difference in the way that that was applied by different areas. And we can see that at NHBT 307355. It's a minute of a meeting on the 10th of August 1989, MBTS CBLA Liaison Committee. And if we turn over to page 4, we can see at paragraph 5 that it's reported that differences between regions on whether or not product costs were passed on to district users was leading to confusion. Where costs were passed on the district's commercial suppliers were sometimes being considered as alternatives to BPL. Dr. Moore expressed the hope that following a meeting of regional transfusion representatives on the 8th of May, a common policy of regions absorbing all costs and supplying free product to districts would be adopted. In some cases, however, it was difficult for regions to claw back from district budgets money previously allocated. So that, I suspect, is an issue that we will be coming back to in forthcoming hearings. I just want to pick up some correspondence from 1990. NHBT 0015646 between Dr. Gunson and Dr. Contreras, Professor Contreras, 31st of May 1990. Dear Harold, national self-sufficiency in blood and blood derivatives. And she says there, I'm writing on behalf of the Eastern Division of Consultants following their meeting in May on 24th of May 1990. And she says, members of the division expressed their dissatisfaction about the lack of interest of the Department of Health in self-sufficiency. It was stated that it is not enough to say that ministers are committed to self-sufficiency if this is not backed by actions and financial support. We firmly believe that the time has come to reassess the situation regarding self-sufficiency. Members of the division feel strongly that there is no reason why the plasma donated voluntarily by British donors should not go back to British patients. There are very good ethical and financial reasons for the encouragement of self-sufficiency. Why should we be paying twice for albumin and clotting factor concentrates? We are paying the commercial companies for imported products and at the same time are spending vast sums of money in apheresis and routine blood collection, as well as in the sophisticated running of BPL. Isn't it about time the department made up its mind that the only way to succeed in self-sufficiency is by subsidising BPL? If we continue with current practices, we will be cutting our own throats. We already have the precedent of BPL competing with a regional transfusion centre for the supply of products to a particular hospital, with BPL undercutting the NBTS discounted price. We feel that it might not be too late to turn the clock backwards as core providers within the NHS. As core providers within the NHS, we feel that the NBTS should be excluded from charging. I've been asked to tell you that consultants in the division are willing to go public on the issue of self-sufficiency and are even prepared to stage a parliamentary lobby campaign. Please, grateful if you reply within the next 2 weeks. And the reply from Dr. Gunson can be seen at NHBT 0015645. It's dated 13th of June 1990. And it says, if this matter were made public at the present time, in my view, the scenario is likely to be as follows. The department will reiterate that ministers are in full support of self-sufficiency and illustrate this by citing the recent executive letter. For those that want to look at that, it's DHSC 303978_009. We don't need to look at that. Now, but that's the reference for it. They will point out also that financing has been provided for RTCs to collect the required quantity of plasma to provide sufficient products to achieve self-sufficiency. Moreover, they have told BPL to make every effort to ensure that their products are the preferred product for use in the NHS. It is true that when we asked for a financial supplement for either the cost of plasma or for BPL, the department refused on the grounds that they were not convinced that this was necessary at the present time, and evidence will be cited that the national agreement is, in most instances, working well. Also, although it is early in the financial year, it will be pointed out that the supply of albumin to hospitals is above target. If one targets factor VIII or even albumin as a product which is not being used in quantities which are available from BPL, the argument will be put forward that the DH cannot interfere with clinical freedom, and since we are not a totalitarian state, no person can be forced to use a particular product. If in the coming months it is apparent that there is an increasing stockpile of products at BPL and no action is being taken to ensure their distribution to hospitals for use, then I would agree that this should be brought to public attention. To do so now, I think, would be counterproductive, and I hope that the members of the Eastern Division will agree with this conclusion. So just before we finish, sir, this, just to draw out some of the themes in this piece of correspondence, it seems that Professor Contreras is raising concerns that the cross-accounting, that's, as I understand it, that the process of cross-accounting has effectively put regional transfusion centres in direct competition with BPL in terms of providing products to hospitals. And she also raises the concern about the cost to regional transfusion centres from effectively having to pay twice for product, once through the functions of the RTC by collecting blood through whole blood collections and plasmapheresis, and secondly because they then don't get enough product back from BPL and have to buy in commercial products. But Dr. Gunson seems to be raising a slightly different issue, and it's a little unclear to me how he gets to that from Professor Contreras' letter. But he seems to be raising an issue in relation to a stockpiling of product by BPL, and that one of the reasons why, perhaps why, regions are not receiving the product that they need is because of stockpiling. And so that is likely to be an issue that we will need to come back to in forthcoming hearings.
Does he say there is actually stockpiling taking place at the present?
No, he doesn't say that. He says, but he seems to raise it himself. It seems to be something that he has raised himself as potentially a reason.
I mean, he may be perhaps addressing the questions of the internal market which Dr. Contreras raises, say that the internal market means that one supplier is compared to another on price, by saying, well, if it's the case that BPL products are not accepted, then obviously at the production levels which it's required, it'll build up a stockpile.
Yes.
And once it does that, then that should be brought to public attention. In other words, you're putting public pressure on the market to do what you want.
Yes, it's slightly odd. I suppose the point I wanted to make was it's slightly odd to talk about it in those terms when Professor Contreras seems to be saying we're having to buy commercial products because we're not getting the product that we want, enough of the product that we want from BPL. In other words, there's a lack of product coming from BPL, which is forcing us to purchase commercial concentrate. She uses the phrase, she talks in terms of having to pay twice.
Is she doing that, or is she really complaining about the problems created by the internal market? That is that there are suppliers competing with each other on price, and BPL is not necessarily succeeding, and yet they are supplying BPL with plasma.
Well, I think she's doing both of those things, but she says in terms, why should we be paying twice?
That is, paying the cost of plasma collection.
Yes.
And paying for some other product.
Yes.
But then the answer given to that by Mr. Gunson, I'm not expressing any view upon the merits of these different points of view, just trying to identify what they are, because I think it's not, I agree with you, I don't think it's entirely clear. But it may be that what he is saying is, well, if we do raise this, as you're threatening to do by the consultants raising a public awareness, going to the press or whatever about it, these are the answers which I think the department's going to give, and amongst other things, they'll say, well, you can't tell the clinicians what product to use. They think there's something better that their patients should have.
Yes.
Or something different their patients should have.
Yes.
I think we can look at these at leisure and work out perhaps what the dispute is really about, and perhaps evidence will help us.
Yes.
From Dr. Contreras, I expect. Professor Contreras now.
Yes. So, sir, that was those are the last documents I wanted to draw your attention to in relation to self-sufficiency. Tomorrow, I'm going to deal with the issues of testing for HIV and hepatitis C, and then a handful of very short topics.
Yes. Well, let's break now then, and come back tomorrow at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock. Thank you.